それでは本日はどうぞよろしくお願いします。改めて本日のテーマについてお話をします。この徳島国際消費者フォーラム、新型コロナウイルス感染症の世界的な流行パンデミックを契機とした消費者を取り巻く国際情勢の変化を踏まえた持続可能な社会の構築をテーマに、皆さんと議論をしてきました。でその結果、本日の座談会ではコロナと地球温暖化、そしてそれらに消費者としてどう対処すべきなのか、そしてエシカル消費や持続可能な消費、これは果たして地球規模の運動に展開できるんだろうかということであります。まさにどうすれば地球規模な運動に発展できるのかということを議論していきたいと思います。
In the fashion industry, I think in a similar way, it's become much more obvious that the impacts of supply chains on workers, and one of the most dramatic impacts has been, as you would know, a vast majority of fashion consumed around the world is produced in less developed countries, particularly countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, China, Ethiopia, and so on, and Cambodia. And what we've seen is that many of the global fashion brands have abandoned the workers in those factories by not paying for orders that they'd already placed. And there's been a worldwide campaign to get them to pay for that consumption, that production rather, and pass have the factories passed on the wages to the employees. So the impact on poor people is very severe in that particular industry. I think both attention on climate change and attention on COVID have drawn people's attention to it's kind of like the world biting back. I mean, the world has been mistreated, and it's making us notice. There's a lot of evidence that pandemics like COVID are impacted anyway by destruction of the natural environment.
So I think two things in particular have become clear in the US. We have the most COVID cases of any country in the world. And in large part, that has been due to the rampant production of misinformation and disinformation around the crisis and what you can do to help prevent it. So with COVID, you can see this parallel happening in the spin and the fake news that is going around that is misinforming citizens and thus essentially prolonging the crisis. The second thing I think that's important to note is that COVID has really brought into sharp focus this situation of inequality or poverty in the US. Many small businesses and their business owners are being really crushed by this crisis. They cannot handle the economic downturn that the crisis has brought along with it. So I think those two things are efforts that we need to redouble in our focus on trying to both get through this crisis and trying to help consumers be more sustainable.
I'm sure that he and I both believe that we can empower consumers to make better choices through information and use consumer voices to help pressure businesses into making ethical products more accessible. But other people would take the view that the only way we create real change is through government action. But one specific example that I thought was very interesting was the UK Parliament's recommendations about taxing cheap and nasty clothing. I mean, it wasn't exactly that, but it was the penny tax. I don't know what your view on that policy proposal was, Rob.
Yeah, we have a problem of very short life clothing. We call it fast fashion in the UK, and people wear it for a day and throw it away because it is so cheap. And there was an idea of putting a tax on this. It would be great if that would happen, because it can. So the thing about consumers and business can coordinate and they can achieve change, but if government comes in and makes a regulation, they can make it run across all the sectors very quickly. So in a sense, they hold the key to very swift change. However, consumer and business can set the direction of travel and try to do as best they can, while often the governments catch up, I think it's fair.
And the reality is that now we have an economic crisis, that people are fearful for their jobs, for the future. So they went back first into precautionary savings, and also now are really arbitrating in their consumption, and price is playing a big role there. Then you have the situation in developing countries. In developing countries, people are really, as was said before, so I'm not going to repeat, the poor were hard hit. There is really a bad situation, very worrisome situation. And in this case, I think the first, the priority of the people is really to survive. And I don't think they can afford to kind of have ethical consumption. And in this case, also in developing countries, we don't find always the greener and alternative products. So that's the issue. Then we get back to what we call institutional consumption, companies, government, etc. So here we talk about sustainable procurement. And we hoped that the COVID crisis would kind of give a boost, more impetus to sustainable procurement in the framework of the packages, the stimulus packages. So we are advocating for increasing the level of green procurement in those packages. For example, in the rehabilitation of buildings, in the purchasing of electrical vehicles, etc. However, we're a bit disappointed for the moment because we think that the level of the percentage of green measures in the framework of green packages is insufficient.
Ethical consumerism, an attempt to target people with lesser means, people that are on budgets. I think the tendency, one of the critiques of ethical consumerism is that it is targeted or participated in mostly by elites and by people with some means to have choice over what they're purchasing. And I think part of what we see with this crisis is that not only are people of lesser means more deeply affected, but when it comes to even the elections in this country, electing representative leaders, I think what we saw in the US was there was a huge segment of the population that felt marginalized, in part because of their of the inequality that is perpetuated in the country. And I think these conversations that we're having are often ignored by people who feel like they don't have choices or can't participate. And I think part of the problem is that ethical consumerism, like most of the citizen consumers that I talk to and who are my audience, they are consumers that are fairly well educated and have quite a bit of means and can make those choices. And I think, we really need to refocus our efforts to make sure that we bring everyone into this project of ethical consumption. And to do that, I think we need a serious realignment so that we essentially open up the gates to bring in the people who are otherwise ignored by the systems that we ourselves create.
I think that's a very good point, Ellis, but certainly our experience, I've got 2 points. The first is that our experience at Good On You, we get a lot of people writing into us and they are very focused on this question of saying, I want to consume ethically, I want to make sustainable fashion choices in our case. Can you help me discover lower priced options? So I think that suggests that there is certainly an appetite amongst people who feel they cannot afford to purchase the more expensive sustainable options for finding a way that is sustainable. There's also very interesting ongoing research in Australia into attitudes to consumption by Mobium Group. And they've been doing it for about 12 years. They've done it about 6 times, fairly big surveys with a mixture of survey responses and interviews. And their conclusion is that across the population by demographic, the interest in and appetite for sustainable consumption doesn't vary much. At one hand, you've got 10 or 15% of the population who are strongly engaged. At the other end, you've got 8% of the population who think it's all rubbish. Some of them will be climate change deniers. And in the middle, you've got this 75% of people who will say that they want to consume ethically, and then half of them feel bad when they don't and half don't. And across that bell curve, it's pretty much poor and rich and men and women, perhaps a little bit more women, a little bit less men, but not strikingly so on that research. So my conclusion is that people of lesser means in the richer countries are just as likely to be interested in sustainable consumption. So it's really a question of capacity to do that, and what kinds of choices that means for them and what kinds of options they have. I'd be very interested in Rob's experience.
Because we define ethical consumer behaviours as quite broad, we see them in places that you might not otherwise do. And one of the things that we've been mapping a little bit in research here is as a result of the Black Lives Matter campaigns, both in the States and in the UK, there have been solidarity purchasing projects springing up. I think we counted maybe more than 100 local projects to support Black-owned businesses by Black communities who were struggling in this time. And so there was, and so these are poor communities who are who are making what are essentially ethical choices. They don't necessarily fit our view of what sustainable consumption looks like. But I think we can call this, people, they are thinking of other things about when they're making their purchases. So I think that we can see poorer communities making really interesting ethical choices around them. We've also had, boycott behaviours around some of the advertisers who advertise on Facebook and other channels that are putting out misinformation at this time. So there are really lots of interesting behaviours that don't necessarily fit the pattern that we would notice around sustainable consumption. And I think some of the big movements that exist globally inside the sustainable consumption world, like I would say fair trade is a classic example, is very, very conscious of price. And it does want to try and get mass market buy-in from both rich and poor alike. So it is very careful to try and price its products competitively, and has had some very marked success from both poor and rich communities in the UK by careful targeting. So I think it's more complicated than it looks to say that it's just something that's practiced by rich people and poor people can't struggle to do it, because I think it's more complicated than that. And in a sense, on the sustainable consumption side, we also know that a vast amount of the impacts are created by the richest in society, in a sense. So if we are talking to rich people about sustainable consumption behaviours specifically, that is a well-targeted message.
I mean, it's interesting to think about, when I think about resilience and sustainability, I think about the broader definition of sustainability that is almost always ignored, right? We think of it almost immediately as an environmental concern, and we don't think about, economic sustainability and social sustainability and political sustainability. And it just, again, I think I circle back to when ethical consumerism started, it was always social and environmental responsibility. But what we've seen, I think, over time is most of the data and most of the efforts end up being more environmental. And the social tends to be marginalized. It's more difficult to measure. It's more difficult to get people on board. And so, I think this is really an area that we need to refocus. I'm really glad to hear about the Black Lives Matter focus in the UK and things like that. I just think we need more of it. I think that social element needs to come to the fore and needs to be equal, if not of greater concern than the environmental element has been for the last, I think, 20 or 30 years.
そう、ファリード、国際的な連携の立場からコメントもお願いします。
For example, companies, when they talk about social or responsible procurement, they really put social matters at the core, notably issues of forced labor, modern slavery are really prevalent here in France. So I wouldn't say that sustainability is really leaning only towards environmental matters. I believe that at least what I see here in France, there is a balance, between the two dimensions.
もうだんだん次第にみんながホットになってきてですね、これはもう何時間あっても時間が足りないんじゃないのかという感じがします。本来ならば、皆さんと徳島で会ってですね、こういう議論を、オーディエンスを交えてですね、本来展開したいと思っているわけです。で、そういう中から、先ほどファリッドさんがやはり国際的なその視点の中でどうやっていくのかと、アメリカ、イギリス、そしてオーストラリア、それぞれの個別の活動がありました。しかしこうやって一堂に会すると、やっぱりいろんな意味でのやり方の違いであるとか、視点の違いとか、そういうものも出てきていると思う。しかしそれが全部私たちにとって参考になるようなお話を聞けたんだと思います。そういう意味では日本がいわゆる位置的に一番近いところはルースさんの私たちのアジアだと思うんですよね。まず近いところから国際連携できるんではないのかと思っておりますけれども、持続可能な社会の実現のためにアジアの中でルースさんはASEAN のリーダーでもあります。フィリピンの連携についてぜひご意見を聞かせてください。
Ethical consumption is a challenge to both the rich and the poor, because while the poor people don't have money or cannot afford to buy sustainable products, the rich who might choose to purchase sustainable products online receive their products in 5 layers of plastic filled with plastic bubble wraps. Activities done in Asia. The Philippines has, the ASEAN, the 10 member states of the ASEAN has an existing cooperation with the government of Japan. The goal of the ASEAN is to build high consumer confidence by heightening consumer awareness in the region that includes the understanding of sustainable consumption.
I wanted to say that there is a network about to be established on green public procurement, and I hope everyone will be able to join. It's very important that we join hands in Asia Pacific on these topics, that we exchange know-how, that we harmonize our purchasing criteria and eco-labeling also tools. And also I would like to point the existence of the One Planet Network, which is a delivery mechanism for Goal 12. It's a major tool of the UN, and we have 3 programs there: sustainable procurement, consumer information, and lifestyle. So I'll be sharing the information with Professor Nakahara, and I hope this will be, and of course this will reach you.
本当にお忙しいところ皆さんありがとうございました。この座談会に参加していただいた各国の皆さん、本当に感謝申し上げます。と同時にですね、皆さんの活躍がもっともっと広がることをお祈りにいたします。で、同時に日本でもこの動きをですね、政府にも呼びかけ、そしてそういう中で今回のこの座談会に関しても消費者庁、これの戦略本部、国際拠点が今徳島にできつつあります。もうスタートし始めてます。で、そういう中から徳島を今度は拠点にしてですね、国際的なつながりをもっとやっていきたいと思いますので、ぜひ皆さんの協力をお願いしたいというところで、この座談会を終わりにさせていただきます。